Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see so many people here on Saturday morning down in Pearse Street. My name is Brendan Teeling. I work in Dublin City Council, and have been involved in the Dublin Festival of History since its inception back in 2013. We're now in our 10th year. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the first of our big weekend talks. I'd like to welcome also Vanessa and Cormac, who are going to be doing our ISL interpretation. I welcome everybody here in the room, but also people watching online as we're live streaming the event as well. Just to say, Willem-Jan Verlinden will be signing his book after the talk. The bookshop, I'm sure you saw it on your way in, and if you just follow the staff, they'll tell you where to go in order to get the book signed. It's over just a little bit up the hallway. Our first moderator is Emily Mark Fitzgerald. We're delighted that Emily has joined us. Emily is Associate Professor and Head of the School of Art, History and Cultural Policy at UCD. And just to flag up that she's the co-author of a forthcoming book, Dublin and the Great Famine. That'll be launched in 2 weeks' time, so keep an eye out for that. Promises to be an excellent read. Willem-Jan Verlinden was born in the Netherlands. He studied art and history in Leiden, I beg your pardon. He's now worked for a number of museums and art foundations, and he's the co-author of a book, How I Love London, Walking Through Vincent van Gogh's London. I probably pronounced Van Gogh wrong. I might be put right on that. We all learn something every day. Ladies and gentlemen, a great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our sessions here on the Dublin Festival of History. Thank you.
Welcome all to my lecture on the Van Gogh sisters here at the Dublin Festival of History. First, I'd like to thank the Dublin Festival of History for inviting me here today with you. And I'd like to go, as the first 15 minutes of this occasion, to go through the lives of the sisters from the angle of their education and their youth, and in that way shine a new light on the Van Gogh family as a whole. This is a portrait being assembled for a newspaper article being published in El País in May, June last year, as this book, the Van Gogh sisters, came out with Thames and Hudson. You see from left to right the eldest sister Anna, the youngest sister Willemien, and the middle sister Lise. Maybe the least known of these three sisters was Anna, the eldest, so to your left. Here on a different picture. Being born in 1855, as she would turn out to live a life very identical to the path her parents, Anna van Gogh Carbentus, here in a picture of 1905, and her father, Doris van Gogh, would have intended for her ever since their youth in Zundert. This is the vicar, the father of the family. Zundert is the name of a small village in the western outskirts of the Dutch province of Noord-Brabant, on the Dutch-Belgian border, where between 1853, the birth of Vincent, and 1867, the birth of little brother Cornelius, all 6 Van Gogh children were being born. Anna, the oldest I just shown to you, went to this school for a year together with her brother Vincent. But the number of classmates in the classroom was too big, as up to 100, and the level could not meet the Reverend family's standard, especially the language some of these children used. So it wouldn't last for a long time, but it gives you an impression of Zundert around 1900, And for your information, the vicarage was just across from this building. So this is where they would live. The town hall would be on the opposite side, and then at the other end of the square would be the church where the father preached. Supported by different governesses, the Van Gogh children would be educated from home until they were ready for the transfer to further education. Both the parents you've just seen would participate actively in the upbringing and education of their children. Not the minister, but their mother was pious and God-fearing in daily life. She was also very creative, taught her daughters in crafts, especially needlework and knitting. A demonstration of her creativity would be when she would teach her children how to draw and paint watercolors. This is an example of that. It's very rare that it's a nice occasion that I can show you a watercolor by the mother of Vincent van Gogh. It dates back to 1844, so that would be like 7 years before she got married, still lived in The Hague, and was in close relationship with other families in The Hague into the art world. So she would get painting and drawing lessons together with her younger sister from Van der Zande Bakhuizen, and as a result of that, she made these kind of still life, flower still lifes that we still can see today. You can see it, she signed it with pen and ink at a right angle, A.C. Anna Cornelia Carbentus, her maiden name, 5th of March, 1844. In this Protestant family of the 1850s and 1860s, all family members were very dependent on one another, not only because of their religion, but also because of their status in the local society. You must know they lived in the south of the Netherlands, which was predominantly Catholic, and they, of course, were Protestant. So the children would play indoors and would learn a lot about other useful pastimes, practical and applicable in their later future. I'm especially referring here to the reading of books, literature, novels, poetry, but also what we today would call non-fiction. The sisters and their brothers would start to write for themselves. Especially the writing of letters was elevated to an art form. Their parents showed great example in this, and so did other family members and friends with whom contact was kept through letter writing. You see here a letter dating from mid-September 1881 by Vincent, writing from Etten, another village quite near to Zundert. And what you can see here is the way he treats the paper, so he writes very clearly and finely. But he also starts drawing, and I included this letter especially, and there are other examples, of course, but to show you very clearly that the oeuvre of Vincent van Gogh is outstanding in this way, that you can see his paintings and drawings, of course, but you can also read his letters and see how he draws and sketches sometimes in advance on the paintings that he's going to paint later on, and is going to comment in the letters on what he's going to draw. So this is an example, an early example of the 1881, just 1 year after he decided he would become an artist. As he had moved to, later in life, all Van Gogh children would write to their parents and each other from wherever they were in the country, in Europe, or in case of the youngest brother, Cornelius, the world. Oh, where did Cornelius go? Sorry, Cornelius is left out, but I'll quickly comment on him. He's the youngest brother to the family. Being born in 1867, he stays with his younger sister Willemien and the mother after the father dies, we'll see later on, and then move to South Africa. But he was not much of a letter writer, so we don't know so much about him as the rest. Van Gogh children were broadly educated. On their curriculum, subjects one expect like reading, writing, math and Dutch language, but also history, geography, geometry, singing, and later on drawing and gymnastics would be obligatory in school. Many of them played the piano. All three sisters did, and especially middle sister Lies was very good at it. But creativity in the arts didn't stop there, as they also wrote poetry, and at the age of 26, Lies van Gogh would decide that she would dedicate at least 1 hour a day to the writing of poetry, as she wanted to become a poet herself. Anna, Lies, and Will would keep a poetry album until they had grown up to be young women. And Willem-Jan van Gogh is known to have participated in several plays when the family lived in Nuenen, so in the 1880s. And so did youngest brother Cor. But why would parents emphasize so strongly on a broad and creative upbringing of their offspring? Much has to do with status here. The Van Goghs, as were the family of their mother's side, the Carbentuses, were of upper bourgeois class. Self-sustainability was an important goal in the upbringing of those children, and especially for the female half, who were considered to organize their household and entertain their guests, but would leave the housework to servants and cooks, hence the stressing of reading, writing, and different sorts of crafts. From that education, Anna, who in the early 1870s would go to the school for young mistresses in Leeuwarden, you already see here on display, which is in the north of the Netherlands, would become a very caring, tidy, and devout woman. After teaching French at a school for girls in Welwyn, Hertfordshire, England, north of London, some 40 miles north of London, she would, in 1877, return to the Netherlands to become lady-in-waiting at the Van Houten family. Here you see the front of the house in Welwyn, where she stayed from 1875 to 1877. She came to London in 1874 with Vincent, and it's also very remarkable that a year later, in 1875, youngest sister Willemien, at the age of 13, comes to Welwyn and stays there for almost 9 months. With Johan van Houten, the man she meets in 1877, she will marry a year later in 1878. She'll marry well and would live the life that had been prepared for her in the years of her upbringing by her parents. She would also have 2 daughters marrying vicars, and in this way would stand in a family tradition. But Anna was also the direct cause for a great quarrel with Vincent over their father's death in 1885 in Nuenen, as Anna, as a spokeswoman of the rest of the family, frankly stated to Vincent that his arguing and intolerant behavior towards their father was the direct reason for his passing, and that he now would have to go to prevent this from happening again to their mother. And so he did, almost 1.5 years later. He went to Antwerp and then to join his brother Theo in Paris, never to return to the Netherlands again. Lies was maybe the most artistically engaged, and of the three sisters at least wanted to be that way. She nonetheless became a lady's companion and help in the household to a well-to-do family in Soesterberg around 1880. Not especially what one would prefer, aspiring a career in poetry, but failing in school and later as an underteacher in Dordrecht. With a diploma in teaching, Lies had the best perspectives of the three sisters to pursue a great career in the classroom. This is Lies in Dordrecht in 1878 by the famous photographer Hameter. And she looks very severe and, well, as an already older young woman, not the woman of 18, 19 years old she is at the time. But in the letters to her brother Theo, we can clearly read that around 1879, this all came to an end because she didn't turn out to be just a true thoroughbred pedagogue. The decision would change her life drastically, as within this family she would get involved with the husband to the ill Mrs. Duquesne van Bruchem van Willis, who was suffering from cancer. Lies had to look after her. The situation would even become more painful as Jean-Philippe and Lies would bring a child into this world called Hubertine. This is the diploma Lies got in teaching, but made no use of. And this is the child being born in 1886 out of wedlock. The situation would even become more painful as Jean-Philippe and Lies would bring a child into this world called Hubertine in Normandy, France, born out of wedlock and left with a local grocer's wife as her daughter, an explosive mixture for a lifelong trauma. Eventually, they would marry in 1891, and Lies would continue writing poetry and stories, also the life story of her then famous brother Vincent a few decades after his death, but not to everyone's satisfaction. She wrote for newspapers and even performed in radio broadcasts. She would be active, spreading her thoughts and ideas until the end of her days. Lies died in 1936 in Baarn without seeing her firstborn from Normandy ever again. Will, or Willemien for short, being at home most of the time, spent the first half of her life especially serving others. She would take care of the sick and the elderly in the circles of family and friends. For Will, at a later stage, a boarding school was found. She stayed there for 2 years with an emphasis on crafts in her curriculum. Willemien, together with youngest brother Cor, spent a long time with their parents and after their father's death with the mother. In Breda, where Cornelius would part to Amsterdam, later in Leiden, and after that in The Hague. The move to Leiden, here you have Cornelius. Cornelius then moved to Amsterdam, as I just mentioned, and he was a bit unresty and went to Britain, first to London, then to Lincoln, as you can see here, it was Lincoln, UK, and then boarded a ship to South Africa. The move to Leiden meant a lot to Willemien. So it's 1889 and a lot is going to change in the family. This is one out of a series picture of Willemien from 1878 from Leiden, the same photographer as photographed Anna you saw before. And that was at the occasion that Anna got married that year. And she took her sister who was staying with her to the same photographer. She's got a series of pictures from the same photographer and the same portrait, but from different angles. So that's very useful. Leiden was close to family and friends in The Hague and Amsterdam, but also closer to education she always would have wanted, and until then maybe have lacked. In Leiden, she started working as a nurse in training at a Protestant hospital in the city center. This is a glass printing from around 1900, a little earlier, that gives you an impression of this hospital at the Rapenburg in Leiden. And although she was very good at her profession and doctors didn't want her to go, Willemien had other ideas for the future. She wanted to become a teacher of the scripture. In this choice, she made a step closer to the ambitions and ideas of her parents, grandparents, and of course, her eldest brother, Vincent. Through her studies, she would meet new friends, very often in the same position as she was, single, Protestant, progressive, and willing to make a difference for the underprivileged, especially for the elderly, women, and children. An example of this kind of relationship, of this kind of friend in Leiden, was her friend Emily Knappert, who was actually like 10, 20 years ahead of her in her ambitions, and who was very supportive of Willemien's studying, and emphasized to Willemien that she would have to finish her courses in order to become a teacher and get some influence in Leiden society. Willemien and other teachers of religion saw this role for themselves, as for women it was not so easy to find a position of influence within society. Being a teacher, they came places, met people, and could make a difference, at least socially and in education. It was the basis, first in Leiden and later in The Hague, where she, in the company of her long lifetime friend Margaretha Meiboom, whom she had known since the Eton years, so since 1878, 1879, they were friends because Margaretha Meiboom was first engaged to her cousin from Amsterdam. When the aunt would come to their house from Amsterdam, this girl would already come to their house. They became friends. They would write, and one of the main things I found in the book was a correspondence between them of 48 letters, with a lot to be revealed on their thoughts and private lives. With Margaretha Meiboom, she would plunge herself into the initiatives of the Library of Women, or what she has become most notorious for, the National Exhibition of Women's Labor, being held in The Hague in 1898. It was part of the first feminist wave in the Netherlands and has been proven to be an enormous success. This was an exhibition held at the same year that Queen Wilhelmina came to the throne, a young woman, 18 years old. And for women, this was a great support, because if a woman could become queen, then women could do anything. And it was especially at this year that they wanted to have a full exhibition of anything women could do to show that to the world. They made a large a large profit out of it and could fund the first feminist organizations in the Netherlands with the outcome of this exhibition. Willem-Jan van Gogh was in the committee, in the committee of proceedings, and you can see her at the extreme right standing. Maybe you can recognize her from previous photos I've just shown you. These are her friends. These are the circles where she lived and worked in at the end of the 1890s. Willemien received many thanks for her hard work. She was very good at organizing things and motivating people to make this exhibition a great success. For a couple of years, she would return to the teaching of the scripture. But her behavior became weirder and weirder, and so it came to a point where the situation could no longer be avoided, that Willemien had to be admitted to a psychiatric care. Anna, being her eldest sister and still close to her, also from the Welling years, would stand by her side during this process and in later years also. Tragic, as Willemien had discussed these kinds of mental situations with Vincent in their letters before, and especially with her friend Margaretha Meiboom, who warned her not to think badly of asylums, as they could bring you peace and tranquility. But here it seems that Willemien had postponed going there for too long. She was admitted to the psychiatric ward of Veldwijk in December 1902 and would continue to live there until May of 1941, against her will, artificially fed, well taken care of, but against her own free will, a tragedy. And that's where I would like to end my summary.
Thanks so much, Willem-Jan. Can folks hear me okay? Yes, grand. Thanks, everybody, so much this morning for coming out to hear Willem-Jan talk about this wonderful book. What we're going to do for the next few minutes is have a bit of a conversation about the book, and we'll have some time at the end to be able to ask a few questions if folks in the audience have questions as well. As was mentioned, my name is Emily Mark Fitzgerald, and I'm Associate Professor in the School of Art History and Cultural Policy. As you can imagine, Van Gogh is an artist who perennially is of interest to our students, and I think the wider public. I think it's probably fair to say everyone knows who Vincent van Gogh is. Yeah, lots of nodding faces. And just in terms of, this is what I always do in my classroom, the birth order, because there are actually 7 Van Gogh children in total, right? So there was Vincent, which is not the painter, but the first son who was stillborn. And then Vincent, the painter, whom we know. And then Anna. And then Theo. Lies, Willemien, and Cornelius. Yes? So that's the birth order. We know something in Ireland about complicated families and the importance of birth order. But also, I suppose, just as in terms of a show of hands, how many folks here have heard of Theo van Gogh? All right, okay. So how many folks had heard, so that's nearly everybody, by the way, for those of us who are joining us online. How many folks had heard of his 3 sisters? 1, 2, 3, 4, a few, just a sprinkling. So in some senses, perhaps that's part of the rationale for the book. I wonder maybe if you could start with this question of why the sisters are not so well known in comparison to Theo, who of course has this voluminous correspondence with Vincent, but there's other reasons why perhaps he's so prominent in the story as well.
The main reason is that everything started, of course, with Vincent. First of all, from his artwork, so his painting, his drawings. And then him as a person, and then him in relation to family, especially Theo. So when almost all hands raise, when you ask if someone knows Theo, that's quite logic, because an emphasis has been made on that relationship ever since, I'd say, the 1950s or something. The sisters join in later for 2 reasons mainly. The first one being they didn't have as much to do with the artistic side of Vincent as Theo did, because he was providing the money, but also being the connection between Paris and Holland to get those works collected, sold, etc. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that he leaves the country in 1886. And the relationship with Anna and Lies was not so strong, so that only leaves us with Willemien.
And so, as we know, and you showed some extracts, the Van Gogh Museum, one of the wonderful initiatives they've undertaken in the last number of years is to fully digitize and transcribe the
Yes.
letters which they hold, which is a wonderful and searchable resource, by the way, really fascinating. And it's such a huge volume of information that's held there. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to some of the sources that you drew upon to really, I suppose, try to reconstruct as well more of the lives of the sisters, who, as we've mentioned, were a bit more in the shadows.
Yes, well, most of the time it's the same source, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, but being a subject not really treated until the book came out. So there was this correspondence of the sisters to each other and to other family members, but especially Anna and Lies were never really discussed before, and Willemien only from the 23 letters that we still have that Vincent wrote to her, that actually were in Veldwijk when she passed away.
Okay. And so much of the book really revolves around it. I think in some respects, it starts with Vincent because he's the instigator perhaps for the interest in the sisters, but it broadens out into a much wider sort of family saga, and this all of the things that happen to the various members of the family over this period of time. But I'm wondering, can you describe for the audience a little bit more about the dynamics, the sibling dynamics in the Van Gogh family, because that's such an important theme of the book.
Yes, I'll try to keep it short, but Vincent being like a very independent personality by himself, who already when they were young, so in the 1850s and 60s in Zundert, would be to himself drawing, spending much time outside in nature, collecting insects, all that kind of thing, but always by himself. And interesting in that aspect is the book by Lies van Gogh from 1910, which is not so factual, not at all, but that she's been writing from her recollection. And that emphasizes very much on how life was in that family house at the time. So don't read it for all the facts, use other sources, but read it to get that impression that you're looking for here.
And you mentioned that he was particularly close with his sister Wil, and that there was a lot of sort of similarities. And as you mentioned, obviously she has a very tragic end to her life, also being institutionalized, and that they had corresponded about mental illness in particular. But what were the other sort of sympathies between the two?
Between the two, that they both liked to read, and a lot in the letters is on books and literature, and the way that makes you feel and how good it is to read, and so that. And what's also good to know, also from the Margaretha Meiboom letters, is that Willemien was an artist herself, not really professionally, but would draw and would paint, and would give her compositions the same names as Vincent would while working in the south of France. So that would be a relationship too. And Willemien would be somewhat of a spokeswoman for Vincent to the mother. So everyone has left the family like at the end of the 1880s. And he would write to the mother and the sister Willemien. And then he would include things in the letter that he would be sure that the mother would read it, or Willemien would tell it to her. So indirectly, he was still in contact with the mother. And I'd say, in answer to your previous question, that it's Willemien and the mother he cares about, and the rest, well, let's put it mildly, not so much. And you can also see that within the painting The Remembrance of the Garden of Atten from 1888, which is now in St. Petersburg, where he emphasizes exactly this relationship with the two most important women in his life.
And it's a really striking painting, I think, as well, and it's reproduced, there's lovely reproductions in the book, and I think it gives such a sort of insight when put alongside the correspondence, because he describes the painting, and he does a sketch of the painting in one of his letters, and I suppose it gives you a sense of as well how different, how eccentric, I suppose, he was perceived by many in his community, his description of this experience and the way that then he's translating that into paint is almost like a hallucinatory, experience of what for them must have seemed quite a strange representation. What were his mother's and sister's responses to his kind of burgeoning artistic sensibilities?
That's hard to tell, because we know from a number of paintings up till 23 that he painted them with the mother and Willemien, or Willemien in mind, so with a close relationship to the home situation. But we don't really have their comment on it. There's just small reactions of Willemien. More important, Vincent commenting on these paintings and gives an instruction how to hang them to the wall. And shows us that he is not feeling very posh about his work, but that he wants it to be part of family life. So you can also hang a small painting by Vincent in the kitchen, or in the hallway, or under the stairs. It's also in the book, that quotation.
And obviously, throughout the book, his mother emerges as a very strong person in her own right, and a character, really fully rounded. But I wanted to ask you about the beginning of the book, because most of the book is written in a chronological fashion, going through the different periods of life of the family. But you begin the book with the death of the father in 1885, and this dramatic moment, because he has a heart attack on the front steps, essentially, of the family home, and it causes this schism in the family because there's an argument between Vincent and Anna. Vincent then leaves and actually never sees most of the family again. So why is it that you began with this particular, very almost kind of dramatic moment, as it were?
Well, various reasons, but one very practical one is that it offered me the schism I was looking for, because I wanted to emphasize the situation of the sisters and tell the story of the family from their perspective. And if I could, leave out Vincent and leave him, letting him leave the scenery from Antwerp to Paris, then I could focus on the family situation, on the sisters more. And then there is also the emphasis you can use to attract the attention of the reader more, because it also summarizes good for them. What's the main idea of the book, and how it might unfold. It might make you curious in a way.
And you had mentioned to me that this is one of the key differences between the Dutch version of this book and the English version.
Yes, it is. It is. In the, let's say, European continental way of writing such a work of history, art history, we tend to follow the time path. So we'd go chronologically through time. But as I was in New York also talking about this manuscript, this book, I got the idea that it would be wise to, get this situation, this very emotional and important situation to the front, and to show in what state this family was when the story starts, and then you can fit everything underneath and unfold the story from there.
And one of the things I think that your lecture you were just giving now illustrates so beautifully is the amount of photographs as well. And the book is beautifully illustrated, by the way, not just with reproductions of Vincent's paintings, but also these fantastic photographs of the family. And I suppose we're talking about a time in the 19th century where photography has now become, a part of people's lived experience to a much wider extent than it had before. And so much of the narrative is about these exchanges of letters and also the exchanges of photographs. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit to that, because there is actually an enormous amount of photographic material which documents the lives of the family.
When we go back into the first part of the lecture, I showed you a picture of Anna around 1872 from Leeuwarden. And if you would flip that picture, you would see the other side that there is inscribed with pen and ink, "For Theo." It was common when you would go to boarding school that your picture would be taken and would be sent to your most important people around you, so to your parents, and in this case also to Theo, because Theo is quite close to everyone in the family. And you see that happen more often. Later on, I showed you 2 pictures from 1878 from Anna also, and from Willemien from Leiden, where she lived and where her picture was taken in the year she got married. That's another occasion to send a picture to people and to also show them how well you are, how well you're doing, and that you want to be remembered by these people where you can't get to as easily as you go today, like that, like in the photograph. So it's a bit of a token to family and friends.
And I think the book paints this really wonderful picture of how the family maintained these relationships over time through this voluminous correspondence. You mentioned that sometimes they were writing each other 2 times a day, as well as this sort of exchange of photographs, which is happening between Brussels and Paris and the Netherlands. I suppose it's a really fascinating insight into the close bonds of this very extended family over this period of time. I wondered also if you might, because one of the things you mentioned was the time of the sisters when they lived in Britain. And of course, that was a really transformative period for Vincent as well. And that's what you wrote about in the book that was previous to this one, that was about Vincent in London.
Yes.
So given that, we're here in Ireland and London's not too far away, you might speak a little bit to why that was an important time, both for Vincent and his sisters.
For Vincent, it was important because there were also years when Vincent was doing well, when people wanted to invest in his career. And that was actually happening in The Hague in 1872, 1873. So he was sent by his uncle, St. van Gogh, the art dealer, to another branch of the firm, which was in London, to have a new focus in his career. And then coming here, coming to London, he would, of course, plunge into a totally different society, because Holland was a bit laid back at that time. We were not that deep already into the Industrial Revolution. And London was, I don't know how many times bigger than Amsterdam, for example. So it was a complete new world to him, which gave him a lot of opportunities. So museums he went to, he was very impressed by the things he saw, and also some things he recognized from home, by the way. But also he was very struck with the situation of the people, and most of that was regarding the people that were most deprived, so the people that had to work or didn't have any work, and were in hunger or drunk, or all that kind of problems. And it awakened him, it awakened a bit the idea that he wanted to do something about it. And the idea, the strong will to do something socially for the deprived in society, is something that we see with Vincent, that we saw with his father, and that we will see later on with Willemien as well. So there's a link. And actually, London wakes him up. Then he goes back to Paris, and there ends his career as an art dealer. But he comes back to Ramsgate and later Arworth as a teacher, and then also, as a lay preacher. And there starts a big, how do you say, he has to get straight for himself what he wants with his life. And that's always been the big question between, will I become a minister like my father and my grandfather, or will I become an artist?
Mm-hmm. And some folks here in the audience may have seen that there was a wonderful exhibition in 2019 at the Tate that was Van Gogh in Britain, looking at that relationship between his time in Britain and the types of work that he produced, but also his influence and his relationship with British artists. And one of those, although not a British artist, but I suppose of interest to the audience is, of course, he was interested in Ireland. Van Gogh was quite interested through one particular medium, which was print journalism, illustrated journalism. And folks here in the audience may be familiar with the painter Aloysius O'Kelly. Yeah, if you've been to the National Gallery and you've seen his painting Mass in a Connemara Cabin, which is one of his best known works. And we know, of course, that Van Gogh collected Aloysius O'Kelly prints of the land wars from the 1880s that were published in the Illustrated London News. And he obsessively collected these kinds of social realist prints from the graphic. And he mentions and singles out O'Kelly's work in his correspondence of being, particularly inspired by the way that O'Kelly was rendering, obviously, these very dramatic events that were happening in Ireland at the time. So I suppose that's the most kind of significant, there's a relationship between the two. And I would mention as well our colleague Niamh Sullivan's wonderful book on Aloysius O'Kelly, which describes much of this relationship between Van Gogh and O'Kelly during this period in the 1880s. Yeah, yeah. I was wondering then, because we're kind of coming up to the time when I'd like to throw it open to the audience, but we might move forward then to the death of Vincent, very tragic, obviously, of self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1890, and the impact that had on his family. You might describe for folks what was the sort of the aftermath of that, and obviously Theo himself being there immediately after, or there at his bedside when he died, but then Theo himself tragically dying from syphilis only 6 months afterwards. So a whole sequence of tragedies really that the family had to cope with.
Of course, that's unbelievable, as in a way, I myself think there's no proof for that, but that it was really an accident that Vincent shot himself. Because if you want to kill yourself, you just put a bullet in your stomach, but there are other ways to get to that result. So, and he also walked back from the field where he performed this act to his bed and didn't lay there to meet his end. But what happened afterwards? Well, first of all, Theo took care of everything, which meant the contact with the people living in Auvers, preparing the funeral, receiving all the guests, receiving also all the letters from friends and family, writing to the family to inform them on almost every step possible on the way to the funeral and after, which are very interesting letters. He would bring, this situation to an end. And later on, in 1914, his then widow, Jo van Gogh-Bonger, would bring them together, as he, of course, dies in Utrecht in 1891, January 1891, so just 5-6 months after this event. They would rest together at the Auvers cemetery. And I think, that's very just, because they were very close to one another, all the letters, but also Theo's wish to take care of Vincent, not only in behavior, but also practically. So making sure that he always had a way of living and that he wouldn't, lose track in life. And I think that's an important thing. And then, of course, the mother is devastated, but you'll never know, you'll never read that in a letter, because she's tough. She's very religious. She finds consolence in her religion. There's this picture in the book from 1905 also, when she sits in the garden with a book and a cane on her lap. And that's really her, that's 1905, so then even youngest brother Gogh would have died in South Africa too, killing himself with a shotgun. When she dies in 1907, she has 3 of her sons that are dead, and her youngest girl in an institution.
Yeah. So quite a tragic end in many respects for the family. And yet, as you mentioned as well in the book, it's Jo, the widow of Theo, who really is responsible in a way for preserving the legacy of the Van Gogh family. You might summarize that for folks a little bit, why and how that came to be before I open it up to questions.
Yes, well, there are a couple of reasons. Jo understands best of all of them what Vincent wanted to do while working as an artist, so she got the idea. And then when Vincent dies, Theo collects everything there is on Vincent, not only paintings and drawings, but also artifacts, notebooks, everything. He brings it all to Paris, and then when Theo dies in January 1891, she will eventually all bring it back to the Netherlands. So she's collecting everything. She has been discussing Vincent with his brother, with her husband Theo, ever since 1886. So she knows what this is all about. She knows the ideas. She's artistic herself. She's very, very capable. We will see that later on in the 1910s and 20s when she is starting on exhibitions. And she will also publish the first letters between Vincent and Theo in 1914. So she's a tough woman, and we have to thank her, especially, that a book like this can be published. I always say in Amsterdam we have Museum Square, and it should be Jo Bonger Square.
And I think the book is really, I suppose, a testament to all of those very strong women who exerted such an influence on his life and, again, are responsible for the preservation, I suppose, of his reputation and work into the present. Yeah. Well, we have a few time for a few questions. If there's anybody in the audience who would like to pose a question to Willem-Jan. Yes?
How much of the mention...
Oh, sorry, there's a microphone, yes, so folks can hear you. Thank you.
Does Vincent get mentioned much in the correspondence you've been reading?
That's actually a good question, yes, especially in the correspondence of the father, the mother, and Theo, who is the liaison in the family and also with the art world to the family. And not all of them write about Vincent in every letter, but those three normally would, at least one or two lines, and sometimes elaborate. Especially the mother, when she is concerned, when some new situation has occurred, you can have like long texts on what he's doing now and how he's dressed and stuff like that. But yes, he is in there, but especially I'd say in the inner circle of the family, which would be his parents and Theo.
And it's fair to say, I suppose, that most of them thought that painting was a bad idea for Vincent, apart from Theo. Is that correct?
Well, I'd say that Theo would always have believed in the capacity of his brother to become a painter, and sometimes from his experience in the art world would advise him to go in a certain direction. But as I try to emphasize with the letter I've shown you, with the sketches in it, it was not only fixed on painting or fixed on letter writing. It was an idea that got to light through those different stages. So thinking them out, writing them down, sketching them, and then finally make a painting. So it's too narrow to just say it's a painting and what did they think about it. No, is he being able to get them along in his thoughts in how to become to a certain painting?
But Van Gogh, presumably, as far as I'm aware, I can't think of anything I've seen that shows him doing that sort of letter to anyone other than Theo, or maybe one or two other people.
Well, especially Willemien.
Willemien, yeah. There's something to Willemien, is there?
Yeah, various letters to her where he describes paintings that he's going to make for her, yeah.
there any other questions folks may have? Yes, this lady down at the front.
Are there any hypotheses as to why there was such poor mental health in all the siblings?
Sorry, hypothesis to what?
Any hypothesis as to why there was such poor mental health in the four siblings? It was the four of them died by, or sorry, there was 2 suicides.
Yes, there is, and it's not an hypothesis, it's a clear sign that the mental problems in the family in Vincent's generation come from the mother's side, as she has a father with mental difficulties who dies under suspect circumstances, and a brother who kills himself, and a sister, a younger sister, with mental problems, who's been hospitalized all her life, a bit like Willemien later on. So there's a very strong line you can relate that to, and we know that because this family, this Carbentus family, kept a document over generations on the most important facts in their family, so names, birth dates, but also what the weather was like that day. And so they also would write down the situations in which someone would die, would leave this earth. And from that we also know that there was mental illness, that there was mental problems in this part of the family.
And it's rather striking, I think, as well, and you write about it in the book, how frank they are actually about speaking about the mental health struggles that they had, particularly between Vincent and Will, but also in the family quite generally. It was something that was acknowledged and spoken about and written about quite widely, so it wasn't sort of a hidden aspect of the family history, but one that was known and acknowledged.
I'd say the family especially would be the surroundings in which you could talk about something like that. Because we're at the 19th century here, so you don't talk about everything with everyone else. So you can talk with your family, your close friends. Because, for example, Margaretha Meiboom, we've seen her at the end, she also had a brother with mental problems. And she also came from a family where the father was a minister. So they were very close related in that aspect too. And they discuss the situation of their brothers in those letters. So it's also a way to get a certain relief and to talk about these things that you can't talk about at other occasions.
Mm-hmm. We might have time for maybe one more question. Yes, maybe the gentleman at the back there. Oh, just do that.
Thank you. A question. So, what do you want to deliver the key message or the learning to the readers through this book? Or on the other word, what are you expecting the readers to get from this book?
That's a good
Lovely
question.
finishing question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, what I'd like to get from this book is what I do most of my writing for, and that is to show you where he came from and what he was really all about, and that it takes to know, it takes one to know someone, so that you have to take into account someone's family background, someone's upbringing, someone's education, someone's situation where he lives in, the situation of society at the moment. All these things combined together to draw you the picture of this family, in this case being told from the aspect of the sisters. But yeah, context, that's what it's all about, being able to place the story.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Willem-Jan. I think that brings us to a really lovely conclusion. And it just remains for me to thank Willem-Jan for sharing with us these details about the book. So thank you. And just a reminder that, of course, there's copies of the book for sale up above, and Willem-Jan will be here after the talk if folks are interested in having their books signed. And so I think Was there folks who wanted to say something about some of the next events that were coming up for the Festival of History? We're good? Okay, we'll leave it at that then. Everyone has the program. Enjoy the festival, and thanks so much for coming this morning.